Nothing's certain in politics, but professionals know one thing. Subscribing to the Cook Political Report is the right decision in every election cycle.
For more than 4 decades, the Cook Political Report has been providing political professionals with the right analysis to help them invest political capital with confidence.
A deep knowledge of the past, combined with a meticulous, unbiased analysis of the present, produces the most accurate predictions of the future, time and time again.
Because it's all backed by data from every input that decides elections for president, Congress, and governorships.
Subscribers to the Cook Political Report get the clarity they need through smart analysis that you won't get anywhere else.
Like the very latest outlook for every race and access to our analysts. Amy Walter, David Wasserman, Carrie Dan, Jessica Taylor, Aaron Covey, and Matthew Klein.
The Cook Political Report offers
the right analysis,
The right analysis.
The right analysis.
The right analysis.
for getting it right. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Hello, welcome to The Odd Years. I'm Amy Walter. Americans have a pretty dismal view of Congress. Lawmakers in the House and Senate are seen as ineffective and a much diminished power under President Trump. Last year, for example, Congress passed a record low number of laws, while Trump issued the most executive orders in 1 year in modern history. Paul Kane, a veteran Capitol Hill reporter and one of its smartest chroniclers, recently wrote a column for the Washington Post in which he argued that, quote, Congress needs a major course correction or else it will slide into a permanent state of weakness that further empowers the presidency. So to find out whether Congress is indeed headed for irrelevance, I checked in with Molly Reynolds, Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at Brookings. Her work focuses on Congress and how congressional rules and procedure affect policymaking. Molly has a more nuanced opinion about the state of modern Congress than maybe some others do, and she helps to put its dysfunction into context. We also talk about what a potential flip in congressional control in 2027 would mean both for President Trump and for legislating overall. We also talk about the filibuster. Lots of great stuff in here. We recorded it on Tuesday, April 7th. Molly Reynolds, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited for this conversation. I am a congressional elections, dork is probably the best way to say it. You are an expert on all things Congress in terms of figuring out how it governs, how it works legislatively. So I feel like we have this perfect symbiosis here to get at the bottom of what I think a lot of people's number one question about Congress is, which is how did it become so dysfunctional and so unpopular?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to recognize that this is not a new development. This is we are where we are as the result of a long series of developments, both internal to the chamber and external to the chamber. And a couple things that I would really underline here. So one are broader changes in our politics. So here in 2006, we are in the midst of an era of closely divided party control of Congress. So Republicans in the House right now, kind of depending on the day, have effective 1 to 5 seat margin. You know, if everyone is here and voting, sometimes we have absences in the Senate. They have a little bit more cushion, but very recently we saw Democrats in the Senate have the closest possible margin. There was tied 50-50 at the beginning of the Biden administration. So this era of closely divided majorities, and then the parties are quite polarized. They are far apart from one another. There's not a lot of overlap in the middle, and the distance between the most moderate Democrat and the most moderate Republican is pretty big. And this really shapes the incentives that members have to cooperate with each other to try and legislate. When both parties kind of look at the next election and think, hey, the majority is in reach, or we might lose the majority, that really disincentivizes any kind of persistent bipartisanship. Because if you're in the minority, you don't want to give the majority wins. If you're in the majority, you don't want to do anything that could make the minority look good in terms of getting their priorities passed, because you want to stay the majority. And that kind of that electoral cycle, those dynamics are really pervasive, and they're kind of at the foundation of the dysfunction. And then you add on top of that the fact that you have parties that want to get things done, like they have policy priorities. And so when you have unified party control, it's become very attractive to just let the president have more power. It's a real kind of the ends justify the means, or the end is more important than the means. And so if you are right now a Republican in Congress and there are things that you want to get done, and it's really hard to get them done legislatively, you are okay with giving up the power to the executive to do that himself. And again, this is not a new phenomenon. What we have seen over the last year is a real expansion in some ways by President Trump in his second term. But this did not sort of come down anew like the stone tablets to Moses 15 months ago.
Right.
This too is a kind of a long, slow trend that goes back over several decades.
Thank you for helping to put that in perspective, because we tend to, in this town, see everything within the narrow lens in which we are currently living. But it is also the case that President Trump has put forth more executive orders than we've seen in modern history. Many of those are still tied up in the courts. So my question to you is whether, yes, we have seen this before, but whether we are entering a new era in which executive authority now gets even stronger. In other words, is a Democratic president likely to follow the same path as President Trump and really try to do much more through executive authority, even if that president's party controls the House and the Senate? Or do you think that Congress somehow wrests it back, or that Democrats feel differently about executive authority than Republicans do? What does this look like?
It's a great question. And I think it's one of the sort of hardest questions facing us at this moment as we look ahead towards the possibility of partisan change in at least one chamber in Congress during the midterms, and then, it pains me to say this, ahead to the 2028 election. I'm not emotionally ready to be thinking about that yet.
But here we are.
One of the big challenges here is, will a future Democratic president kind of look at the Trump 2 playbook and say, actually, there are things that we too want to do with this power that President Trump has expanded. Again, I would describe what's happened over the last year as a real ratcheting up in terms of an expansion of executive power that builds on this foundation that we've seen over a series of decades. And so I think one big question here is a lot of what the Trump administration has directed their executive power impulses towards is reducing government functions. So things like eliminating USAID or folding it into the State Department, the ongoing saga at Voice of America, what they've done at any number of other federal agencies, the Department of Education. So in that sense, we've seen a lot of executive power in favor of cutting things. We know that Democrats generally have kind of a different orientation towards government. Democrats are generally in favor of a more robust set of executive agencies that provide additional benefits and services to people in a way that Republicans just ideologically aren't and haven't been for a long time. So that's kind of one tension that I think Democrats may navigate or have to navigate and sort of think about a future Democratic president. Are there things that aren't cutting that could be done similarly with executive power? I don't know. Building on that, the question of what would the federal courts do when a new Democratic president. And so again, if we think back to, say, the Biden administration and some of the Biden administration's more creative uses of executive power, such as its much of its student loan agenda, that was a place where the Biden administration was very aggressive, really pushed the boundaries of some of its legal authorities and got immediately slapped down by the federal courts. And so the federal courts aren't kind of a neutral arbiter here. They're not just sitting on the sidelines. Different, particularly at the appeals court and the Supreme Court level, those folks have ways that they look at the world that also bear on this question of executive power. And so that, I think, is another piece that we should all just be keeping in mind as we look ahead towards what could come next.
I mean, that's such a great point, because already it seems as if many of President Trump's executive orders have already been hollowed out by court decisions or completely negated by court decisions. And of course, if a new Democratic president comes in 2029, can say, you know what, these things no longer binding, right? Just with the sign of a pen, you can eliminate some of those. So it is both an effective, quote unquote, effective way of governing, where you don't have to go through the whole legislative process. You do have to go through the court process, but you can get stuff done more quickly, more efficiently, theoretically. And yet it is not binding in the same way that legislation is. Or am I thinking about this the wrong way, Molly?
Yeah, I would characterize it as just a really unstable approach to governance. And so for one part of that is what you very aptly described as what one president can do with a pen, a future president can undo with the same pen.
Right.
And so there are any number of kind of executive orders that, as we've gone from Democratic to Republican presidents and back, we've seen kind of alternate between those administrations. I think the other challenge in thinking about the courts here is that even when the courts step in and say this executive order is illegal or this action by the administration is illegal, getting to a final resolution of those questions is a really slow process. And so even when the courts are moving kind of as fast as they can, it often takes a long time to litigate a case all the way to the end. And a lot of damage can be done while that's happening. And so again, we think about some of these cases that are still working their way through the courts around spending for foreign assistance programs that folks thought they were going to get before the dismantling of USAID. And we're more than a year past when those lawsuits were originally filed, and we still don't have a final resolution either on those cases specifically or on some of these bigger general questions about kind of what is the role of the courts in adjudicating this separation of powers between Congress and the president, especially in this federal spending context.
That's right. And even on the tariffs decision, which the Supreme Court weighs in on, right? And it says, we are the final arbiter of this. There are still many questions left about how, for example, refunds are going to work, right? We have to take that to courts.
How are refunds going to work? Are there different authorities that the president is going to try to use if he can't use A, is he going to try to accomplish the same goal via B?
Exactly.
Does that get met with similar court challenges? And I think this point about the refunds is a really good illustration of the idea that you can do damage in the short term, even if something is ultimately found to be unlawful. And then you have to figure out, can you repair that damage? Is there a way to make consumers whole? All these kinds of really hard questions that in a world where we're relying on the courts and on litigation to exercise hard power in the direction of the executive, it really illustrates that so much of what has made the balance of power between the branches work for a long time is much more of a kind of soft power arrangement, where the executive branch was afraid that if it did things that Congress didn't like, Congress would cut its funding, place conditions on its funding in the future. So much more of a kind of repeated play, soft power environment, rather than using the courts, which is much more of a, you got to litigate this. It's a hard power interaction.
And to your point about soft power, it seems as if the executive is actually the one using more soft power in the sense of I know you appropriated these funds, Congress, but you know what? we're just not going to spend it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's been really interesting to watch over the last year is the degree to which there are Republicans who have been unhappy with what the Trump administration has been doing. But by and large, their response has been to find the specific things that they are unhappy about, the things that affect their particular state's district constituents, and say, you know what, I don't like this thing. I'm going to call up the White House, I'm going to call up OMB, and I'm going to get them to fix my one problem. I'm going to get them to try and find more money for tribal radio stations, for one example.
Exactly. Or rural health care.
Exactly. And if they think that the answer to addressing their own objections is to find someone in the administration who can at least tell them that they'll do something about it, that really takes away an incentive for them to act collectively as an institution in the direction of another institution in our separation of power system.
That's an excellent point. And speaking of institutional power, the one place where Senate Republicans have stood strong in the push for more executive authority is on the issue of the filibuster. Joe Biden, when he was president, pleaded with his party to get rid of it. And obviously, this president pushing very hard on Republican leaders in the Senate to get rid of it. And in both cases, the parties stood strong against this push. What do you think this is about?
Yeah, so a couple things here. So first is that, again, if we look at the long history of the filibuster and we look at the creation of the cloture rule in 1917 all the way till now, so when in the early 20th century the Senate put in place the first way to cut off debate with a supermajority, and all the way till now, the evolution of the filibuster has always been a story of majority parties who have something that they really want to do, they really agree on it, they think it's really important, and that they, as a result, are willing to make and are being frustrated by a minority. At that point, they're willing to make a change to the way the Senate works to accomplish that proximate policy goal. So like the original creation of the cloture rule has to do with a proposal to arm merchant ships during World War I that was really important, and that's kind of what crystallized the support for getting the ability to cut off debate in the first place and get really tied to a specific policy question. So if we look over the history since then and say, you know, when in 2013 Democrats made the change to the debate, the number of votes needed to cut off debate for nominees to cabinet departments and to the lower courts, that was again a story of the Republicans had sufficiently frustrated enough Democrats in the Senate that they were willing to come together and make that change. So as we look towards more changes to the filibuster, which I think eventually are inevitable, I think we're on a long, slow march to majority rule in the Senate. The question really is, what's the thing? What's the brick that you're going to take out of the dam that's going to break the dam? And for Republicans, they have not yet identified kind of what that is. So there's a lot of pressure from Trump to do it for some of these election-related proposals, are sort of shorthanded as the SAVE Act. But it's not at all clear that there is support among enough Republicans in the Senate to actually make that change, because for any number of reasons, this doesn't look like it's going to be the thing that makes them make that change. I'll also note that one of the things that the filibuster does for majority parties is it helps them shift blame for things that they often don't actually want to do or don't have the votes to do.
Want to do themselves, exactly.
And I actually think this is a lot of what's going on with the SAVE Act, is that for Republican senators, the reasons are several. So, you know, you have people like Senator Murkowski who has said, you know, actually doing this would have a real disparate impact on some of my constituents in rural Alaska. And so I'm not willing to make a change to the way the Senate works to get this thing done. Other Republican senators have other objections to the underlying proposal. And so for currently Majority Leader Thune, for his predecessors in both parties in the Majority Leader's chair, having the filibuster can often serve as a way to say, you know what, can't do this.
Right. We don't have the votes.
We can blame the rules, which is like the rules aren't magic. They can't force agreement where there isn't underlying agreement. And so I think that's a lot of what's going on with the filibuster. The last thing I'll say is that for Republicans, a lot of what has been really important to the Republican Party in Congress over the last 2 plus decades, is cutting taxes. And because they have other legislative procedures, the ones that they used to do the One Big Beautiful Bill Act last summer, and several rounds of tax cuts before that, they have an outlet for some of their high policy priorities that doesn't require having to overcome the filibuster. So particularly for Republicans, that gives them a little bit of an escape valve. They can do some of the things that are really important to them using different legislative processes that aren't subject to the filibuster. And then the filibuster acts, again, as this sort of blame mechanism for things that they may be feeling pressure from their base to do, but they don't actually have the votes for.
A quick break. We'll be back with Molly Reynolds.
Hey there, it's Erin Covey, the House editor here at the Cook Political Report. Did you know we have another podcast called Editors Roundtable? It comes out once a week and features me and my colleagues pulling back the curtain to let you in on all of our insights on races, ratings changes, polling, and everything else we'll be following this midterm year. You can find Editors Roundtable on Apple Podcasts for just $1.99 a month, or become a paying subscriber to our new Cook Political Report Substack. All this is linked in the episode's show notes.
One other thing I want to get you to weigh in on is what a member of Congress looks like in 2026 versus what a member of Congress looked like, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. I say this at a time when we are now seeing, I think, a historic number of retirements from the House. We know we are seeing, for the first time, more senators leaving to go run for governor. That used to be the opposite. Governors saw it as an honorific, really, to go from being a governor to being a senator. That was a step up. Now many see that as a step down. Are we now looking potentially at a Congress that is going to be made up of people who, one, are not as experienced in legislating as we've seen in the past, and two, just are not quite as interested in upholding many of the traditions that Congress has traditionally held on to and traditionally stood for? And finally, does it say something about the caliber? What kind of people want to run for Congress, knowing that everything we just laid out? The executive has more authority. Leadership has more authority. There's very little that gets done through regular process. What's the incentive? What's the reason to actually want to come to Washington?
Yeah, so this is I think a really important dynamic, and it's also sort of a complicated story if we look back over the last several decades. So on one hand, the House of Representatives today is more diverse, certainly along gender lines, along race and ethnicity lines, along all sorts of dimensions that I think if we looked back at the Congress of the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s, which we often say was like a Congress that worked, the way in which it worked was in part because we lived in a different society, and in a society that did not have equal amounts of opportunity in all kinds of ways, including access to public office. And so I want to caution us against maybe some excessive nostalgia in this area and recognize that the kinds of broad societal changes that have brought us the diversity of our current House of Representatives are not things that we could roll back, and I would argue not things that we want to roll back. So you start there, and then you think about, okay, we have, and I would also note, you hear a lot of times members don't move their families to Washington. And that is also a complicated story in today's world. The kinds of people who run for Congress, more likely to be the kinds of people who have two high-achieving spouses in their household. And that's a different world than the Congress of the 60s and 70s, where the members were men and their wives, by and large, did not work. And so, of course, just move the whole family to Washington. So there's a lot of underlying societal change here that feeds into the makeup of Congress. That said, we are seeing high levels of turnover, lots of members choosing to retire, lots of members with shorter tenures, and that does have consequences for the legislative process. It means that I think it's been a contributor to the empowering of party leaders. So you hear members, complain a lot about how much power is centralized in the hands of their party leaders. Part of why that's true is because it takes members some time, just like any other job, to figure out how to work in this environment. And if you need some time to get up to speed, you're going to listen to who has the information that you need to know to do your job. And increasingly, that's party leaders. And party leaders are strategic in how they distribute that information to their caucuses and conferences. So, and then it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. So power is centralized. Individual members don't have a lot of agency, so they feel frustrated. And so the ones who are really interested in doing the hard work of legislating say, maybe this job isn't for me. If this job isn't for people who want to do the hard work of legislating, maybe it's for the kind of people who get a lot of attention and, decided to run for the House because it seemed like an effective platform to have a public persona. And then if you are, a talented county district attorney in Iowa in a open congressional seat, and you look at the House and you say, oh, the kind of behavior that seems to be being rewarded is people who listen to the party leaders and people who get a lot of attention. And that's not for me. That's not the kind of institution that I want to join. And so and then you get sort of more attention seekers and fewer serious legislators. And it's a cycle that I think we're going to have to figure out how to break I think that's one ingredient to trying to reinvigorate the Congress as a healthy institution in the separation of power system.
And Molly, that seems to get at the real core of it all, right? Which is whether Congress is irreparably broken or whether there is something to do to fix that.
I remain an eternal optimist in the direction of the U.S. Congress. It's not always easy, but I think fundamentally, the Congress, particularly the House, is the part of our government that is meant to be closest to the people and meant to be the part of our federal government that really, adjudicates these disputes between disparate interests around our country. And I think they have to figure out how to make that work, how to take seriously our current politics. Again, I sometimes in these kinds of conversations about, what to do about the House of Representatives, there is this impulse to look back at a golden age of legislating that it was a fundamentally...
It just wasn't.
It was a fundamentally different set of politics than what we have right now. So we have to sort of think about, given where we are and what our politics look like, how can we adapt our institutions to be as effective as they can be in the face of our current politics? And do I think that means that Congress needs to stand up for itself in relation to the executive branch? I absolutely do. But we also, in figuring out how we get there, we have to take seriously kind of what incentives the individual members face in making the decisions that they do.
That is very, very well said. All right, let's zoom out from the big picture, and I'm going to zoom us in to the immediate future, which is the year 2027. It seems more likely than not we're going to have a divided Congress. And so a Republican president and either one or two of the houses in Congress controlled by Democrats. Most likely it will be the House rather than the Senate. The last time we were here with this president and divided government, we had 2 impeachments. Is your expectation that that is what 2027 is going to look like? Just constant clashes between Democrats and the legislative body and a White House, which ultimately culminate in something like an impeachment?
Yeah, so I do think that Democrats, should they control the House. And you're absolutely right that, all kinds of both contemporary, today information about the political environment and our experience with history tell us that this is the president's party loses seats in the midterm. President's party is a very narrow majority. All of the dynamics point towards Democrats controlling the House for the next 2 years. And I think on one hand, we should absolutely expect to see really pointed investigative attempts, oversight in the direction of the executive branch. This is consistent with what happened in the second 2 years of the first Trump administration. You mentioned the two impeachments. I think it will be interesting to see kind of how much pressure there is, both from the Democratic ecosystem more broadly and from within the caucus to pull that trigger. Should Mr. Jeffries be Speaker? This will be sort of his first run through this particular environment. And, we watch Speaker Pelosi really trying to slow walk the impeachment impulses among some parts of her caucus for the better part of a year in 2019. At what point might that kind of pressure become untenable? I don't know. And it, honestly, given some of the things that the executive branch has done, not inappropriately so, pressure for impeachment by the House. So I think that's kind of in terms of the investigative side. I expect that the administration will slow walk their compliance with all of the investigative efforts. Again, we saw that in the first Trump administration. That's another really important illustration of the way in which the courts cannot exist as Congress's sort of backstop to power here, that when you have someone who refuses to testify on the basis of executive privilege and you try to litigate that takes a long time. In the first Trump administration, there was a case involving White House counsel Don McGahn that was not resolved until after Donald Trump wasn't president anymore. And so that's just an important reminder there, too. I think on the legislative side, I'm not expecting some sort of flurry of legislative activity in the second 2 years. But what I will say is that depending on Trump's own motivations and impulses, something we did see in the first Trump administration, particularly in that second 2 years, were occasional bursts of legislative energy because that appealed to President Trump's self-identity as a deal maker. So a thing that, if you think back to last fall when we were on the brink of what ultimately turned out to be a very long government shutdown, there's a lot of concern on the part of Republican leaders on the Hill that Chuck Schumer was going to go to the White House and find Trump in a deal-making mood, and all of a sudden they were going to have a deal that Republicans didn't like. That's not what happened in that case, but it's a helpful reminder that is a little bit of an undercurrent here. And, the second Trump administration is not the same as the first Trump administration. I don't know what's going to happen, but on the legislative side, I think that there's at least a little bit of it that's murky to me. On the investigative side, I think it's a lot clearer that we're just going to see a real burst of aggressive energy directed, again, appropriately, given some of the things the executive branch has done, in their direction.
It feels as if, and maybe this does not turn out to be the case, but that where Democrats are going to focus, say, in a 2027 that will look different from a 2019, 2020, is that it will be more policy focused than personal focused. So much of the investigations, of course, were around Trump's behavior when he was a candidate, right? As he calls it, the Russia stuff. Or in the case of the second impeachment, his behavior on January 6th versus, okay, what is the executive doing led policy-wise that we can disagree with and make our case rather than it being about Trump personally?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting distinction to draw. And I think it is reflective of one of the ways in which the second Trump administration is different than the first Trump administration, which is in its really aggressive use of executive power in the direction of certain policy ends. So you think about, again, all of the places where the executive branch has refused to spend money that Congress has appropriated.
Yep.
And placed new restrictions on grants and all sorts of all of those things. And so there, I do think that it's about executive power, and it's about the use by the president of that power, but it has the kind of concrete policy outcomes are clearer than they were in some of the cases in the first Trump administration. And so it's a lot clearer to explain why the Office of Management and Budget directing freezing of certain federal grants, like what that means, than in the first Trump administration. Part of the first Trump impeachment was also about something that happened at the Office of Management and Budget, but it was about OMB saying that the State Department and the Defense Department shouldn't spend certain money in Ukraine. And so the tactics of power are the same, but the politics and how easy it is to explain to a broader audience are a little bit different.
And the other thing I have heard, especially from some Republicans, is that even if Trump were in a legislating mood and a deal-making mood, the pressure on Democratic leaders from the base to not accept it, right? That what you are hearing now from Democratic voters is this idea of you got to fight him at all costs. There's no compromise. Why would you compromise with somebody as morally reprehensible as this person, right? That is what's coming out in many of these primary contests on the Democratic side. So it seems as if, Molly, we're going to get into a place where the base of both parties is going to be pushing these members in ways that makes it harder to actually fix the things that are broken about Congress.
Yeah, and I think for Democrats, I don't want to go as far as to say that sort of Democrats are having their Tea Party experience, but I think there are some elements of what happened with the Tea Party that Democrats are wrestling with, and this is new for them. And it is because the Democratic Party is fundamentally oriented towards government in a different way than the Republican Party is. This idea that there is pressure from some elements of the Democratic base for Democratic members to fight for the sake of fighting without thinking about fighting towards a particular end is just a different dynamic. And I think it's part of the story of why navigating this series, both the funding fight in the beginning of 2025, the long shutdown in the fall. I think right now Democrats are on a little bit firmer political ground with the DHS shutdown because Republicans in the House kind of failed to reopen DHS when they had the chance. But I think that this is an ongoing new dynamic for Democrats, and it'll be interesting to see kind of where it comes out, again, especially because fundamentally the perspective of Democrats, no one becomes a Democratic member of Congress because they want the government to shut down. For Republicans, you can't make that same statement. There are some number of Republicans who want a smaller government, and if the way to get there is to have the government not do anything for a little while, that's an acceptable step on the way towards their kind of more ideological goal. And it's a different orientation towards what government does for the two parties, and figuring out for Democrats how to integrate their party's philosophy on government with these impulses from the base, I think it's going to be an ongoing political challenge for them.
And then finally, Molly, I know this is maybe not a fair question to end it on, but another topic that gets brought up a lot in this town is the question of what a post-election Congress looks like in the immediate aftermath of the election, and whether challenges to the voting process, whether that is absentee ballots, whether that is the president, as he said, he's going to be able to step in and potentially federalize some elements of the election process, whether you think that we could, in January of 2027, be at a place constitutionally that we haven't been before about actually seating, SEATING, seating a Congress?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing I'll say is just the fact that this question is on the table at all, the fact that you've thought that this is something that should be part of this conversation is itself telling about kind of where we are in the health of our democratic system. So even if none of this ever comes to pass, the idea that, we talked about this, that people in this town are talking about this, that itself is a troubling signal for where we are. I think the other thing that I would say is that one of the both great blessings and curses of the American electoral system is how decentralized electoral administration is in this country. And so, President Trump is consistently, as you mentioned, kind of threatening to federalize elections. At the end of the day, so much of what actually happens to conduct the process is the purview of individual county clerks, and in some cases, even below that, and volunteer poll workers. And is that the most efficient way to run elections? Is it the way that many other democracies run their elections? No, it is not. Is it in some ways a potential check on some of these impulses from the president? Yes. And so I think as we look ahead, we should take these concerns seriously. We should think about what it might look like for their, particularly, given the experience of late 2020 into January 6th. We should not minimize these concerns, and we should recognize that talking about them is itself a signal that there are real threats here. And also we should calibrate where decisions are actually made, how this actually works in practice.
Molly Reynolds, thank you so much for this conversation. So illuminating and so thoughtful. Really, really, really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to The Odd Years. If you liked what you heard or want to make a suggestion, leave us a review or recommend us to a friend. You're our best way to get the word out about what we do. And if you want more from the Cook Political Report, consider becoming a subscriber. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers. The Odd Years is brought to you by the Cook Political Report and is produced by Becca Kaufman.